Today's discussion, we're going to finish up the Washington administration, look at the presidency of John Adams. Looking at the Whiskey Rebellion, Pinckney's Treaty, the Quasi-War, the XYZ Affair, the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Judiciary Act of 1801, and the Revolution of 1800, as it was called. Now, George Washington had a nation of 3.5 million people when he took office, the 41st census of 1790. It was a growing nation, but mostly based east of the Appalachian Mountains. According to the 1790 census, only 125,000 people lived west of the Appalachians. But Washington did face several issues with the West, at least the West at that time. Among other things was issues with Native American tribes. The Constitution declared that the different tribes would be treated as separate nations. The United States government made many treaties with these tribes, however, pressures by settlers to take these lands of the tribes and develop them for their own farms and own uses usually overwhelmed any kind of federal intentions towards the tribes. Treaties are made, fights of the settlers broke out, the army is called in, the tribes have lost, treaties redrew the lines, and the tribes lost more territory. In the process, the tribes are being pushed steadily further and further west. Now, in the Northwest Territories, areas from Ohio west of the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes region, the tribes are being pushed out fairly quickly. Particularly with one issue here, the Treaty of Grenville in 1795. Happens to be an American general named Mad Anthony Wayne. Veteran of the American Revolution, known for his kind of wild and chaotic ways. He marched with his army into far western Ohio with 2,600 men in 1793 and built Fort Grenville. Now, there were still many tribes living in Ohio at this time period, but Grenville was convinced these tribes simply had to go. And with reinforcements from Kentucky, he went on the offensive in 1794 and 1795. And the treaty that resulted after the tribes sued for peace was the Treaty of Grenville. The treaty forced the tribes to cede most of their lands in Ohio and western Indiana to the United States. The land rights to be bought from the tribes for a paltry $10,000. It's only a fraction of what it would actually be sold for by the United States government. And enclaves would be built at Chicago, Detroit, and Vincennes, Indiana. Vincennes is on the Wabash River. These are still tiny cities at this point, a little more just trading posts, but the strategic location of these trading posts was going to be important for the United States. Future years they already recognized. So with this, the United States firmly secured its rights to the southern quarter of the Northwest Territory, clearing the way for rapid settlement, ending tribal differences in that area. So again, so tribes ceding Ohio and western Indiana lands to the U.S. for $10,000. Basically, next to nothing. Of course, as the Americans pushed into other portions of Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, the remainder of the Northwest Territory. They'd be facing still more fights. The Indians would end up losing still more lands. It'd be a steady, relentless push westward. The tribes would be losing everything in the process. Tribes would attempt to fight back, staging their own offensives and their own attacks. The Washington administration periodically would try to buy peace with different tribes by offering them gifts and money to keep them at peace, but many tribes got to the point where they simply just didn't trust the federal government. So many treaties being broken all left and right, so many different tribes, the credibility of the federal government stretched thin. And the intentions of the federal government became quite obvious, was simply to make as much land available for settlement as possible. Even though the tribes were already living there, they were to be pushed out. Another issue was called the Whiskey Rebellion. This was in 1794. You may, no doubt, by this point, remember the Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty meeting in the taverns of Boston, tossing back a few and stirring up rebellion against Britain. Adams himself having been a brewer, several brewers at this point. And of course, after having tossed back a few, the arguments got quite rowdy and had such things as the Boston Tea Party. So once again, alcohol plays a role here. Now, Americans tended to drink a lot more in these days than they do today. One estimate from the 1830s said that Americans on average drank 3 times as much per person than what Americans do here in the 21st century. Quite simple. In those days, you wouldn't drink water. And whiskey was sometimes used as a medication, some issues, just to treat some certain symptoms. And farmers had these excess crops, corn, wheat, whatever, they grew it. Like I said, they enjoyed their whiskey, they enjoyed their beer. Like I said, they lived their lives. Well, go back to 1791. Alexander Hamilton had pushed through an excise tax on strong drinks. Makes his help play for some of the financial plans he'd had in mind for some public credit. Well, for a man like Hamilton, a man of some means, these really didn't mean much. This tax didn't mean a lot to him, but intense opposition erupted on the frontier, particularly portions of western Pennsylvania, areas still west of the Appalachians, or Appalachians moving further west. Well, the frontier was upset because it was taxing a staple crop and accused of Hamilton taxing the poor to benefit the rich. These taxes ended up being placed very heavily on the men of the frontier, and they didn't want to have to pay it. So the tax continued for several years, and people grew increasingly upset about it. In fact, in some cases, the taxes ended up being to a point that courts had to seize assets of some farmers to be able to, so that excise taxes be satisfied. As a result, the summer of 1794, discontent erupted in western Pennsylvania as vigilantes took the law in their own hands, going around blowing up the stills of those who paid the tax, robbing the mail to prevent court orders and summonses from being delivered, stopped court proceedings through threats of violence, even threatened an assault on Pittsburgh. As a result, Washington called up 12,900 militiamen, 4 states. basically national equivalent of the National Guard at the time. Essentially, be from neighboring areas: Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, as well as Pennsylvania. Alexander Hamilton, along with the General Henry Lee, another Revolutionary War figure, marched into Pennsylvania, and the rebellion, as it was, quickly disintegrated. Washington put on a uniform to send the troops on their way, leading them at some point. The main assaults, though, were conducted by Hamilton and Lee. Of this rebellion, of all these people threatening an assault on Pittsburgh, blowing up stills, assaults and threats, only 20 were arrested. And only 2 were convicted of treason, that is, waging war against the United States. That is, they declared war on the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So because only 2 were convicted of treason, Washington decided to exercise for the first time, the presidential pardon. The Constitution gives the president the power to commute sentences and pardon to whomever he wishes, for whatever reason he wishes. So, of these 2 pardons, Washington gave his reasons. One he called a simpleton, the other one was insane. Basically, Washington said one's too dumb to know what he's doing, the other one's too crazy to know what he's doing. So the rebellion is ended. Those convicted were pardoned, and peace generally resumed western Pennsylvania, as well did the ruling. Well, 2 things happened as a result. The government was able to establish its authority by suppressing the rebellion, proving it could stand up for itself and enforce its own laws. But use of force cost the Federalist Party very badly in the elections. Those tied to Hamilton and the others became very unpopular in many parts of Pennsylvania and parts of the western frontier. Now, where Washington had had a disaster with the negotiations with Britain over Jay's Treaty in 1794, where the U.S. got very little out of the treaty, some people did take notice of what happened. The case leads us to the Pinckney's Treaty. Pinckney's Treaty, this is negotiated in 1795. Treaty between the United States and Spain. Now, the issue with Spain had been, while it had been an ally of the United States during the American Revolution, no clear border between the United States and Spanish territory in North America had been established. Spain did claim the lands west of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was seen as a boundary. The United States did not dispute that. However, the southern boundary between Spanish Florida and those territories along the Gulf Coast going all the way back into eastern Louisiana, that was not defined. The United States claimed a border as close to the Gulf of Mexico as possible, but Spain claimed a border that included most of Georgia, most of Alabama, Mississippi, and even portions of Tennessee. The result had been, here in map page 218, that settlers moving into portions of Tennessee and Georgia had increasing violence between the settlers and the tribes. Washington tried to buy peace, and the Creek tribe in particular failed. And so, with more settlers coming in, it leading to increased violence, but Spain more and more seemed to be responsible for inciting these attacks on American settlements. However, Spain was having an increasing problem that because they had so few resources at this point, they're basically going bankrupt. They have little control of what's going on within the Spanish territory. They have little control over any of these tribes. Well, the United States ambassador to Spain was a man named Thomas Paine from South Carolina. Actually, he's called the Minister of Spain, that where they used for ambassador. So his job basically is to negotiate a border between roughly Spanish Florida and the United States. Now here's the thing. Spain had seen what happened between the United States and Britain. The United States did not get a very good deal, but Britain didn't have to sit down and negotiate with the U.S. at all. Britain didn't have to give any concessions to the United States. But they gave some. And Britain is in a much more powerful position than Spain is at this point. So Spain, seeing that Britain gave some ground, that Spain would have to give some ground, just as Britain had done. So the treaty ends up working out very well for the United States. The treaty establishes a border at the 31st parallel, .31 north latitude. This stays roughly the present border of the upper toe of Louisiana between Mississippi and large portions of the Florida Panhandle. But it went more than just that. Because the Mississippi River cuts through Louisiana on its way to the Gulf of Mexico, it had to go through Spanish territory on its way to the Gulf. There were some disputes over the upper part of the river, the boundary, but the biggest concern for the United States was getting boats from the Mississippi, particularly down the Ohio, Wabash, and rivers, and the Tennessee rivers, the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. But they'd have to go through Spanish territory, through Spanish Louisiana. And the Spanish were not allowing that. So through Pinckney's treaty, Spain gives the United States that right to travel through Spanish territory along the Mississippi River. So free navigation of the Mississippi River. Plus, warehousing rights in New Orleans. New Orleans is already a very important port, and the U.S. gets the right to deposit goods at New Orleans warehouses. Previous to this, the United States and any other outside power did not have the right to do that. So warehousing rights in New Orleans for up to 3 years. Works out well for the U.S. Options for renewal on the warehousing rights. Promised by each side to refrain from deciding a Native American tax on the other side. Very popular treaty. The United States got a lot out of it. A lot of territory, navigation in Mississippi, excellent rights for merchants, because the Mississippi River is becoming an increasingly important avenue of commerce for the United States. Wasn't a lot of people west of the Appalachians yet to be able to use the Mississippi, but that population was growing, that commerce was growing. The U.S. knew it would only increase in the coming years. The United States got everything it could possibly ask for with this treaty. Very popular, quickly ratified. So 1796 comes along. Washington decides that 2 terms in office has been enough and announces his retirement. President Washington at this point set the precedent for presidents serving 2 terms in office. And all other presidents would follow this up until Franklin Roosevelt ran for and won a 3rd term in 1940. While it was legal for presidents to run for 3rd terms, it was rarely done at this point. Usually because presidents are too old, too tired, or administrations too scandal-ridden for them to even consider a 3rd term. But mostly out of the tradition that Washington decided power was to be given up. Power belonged to the people. The presidency did not belong to one man. that our nation, we were to have a system where ordinary people step into positions of power. Like I said, with this, Washington did something almost unheard of by voluntarily giving up power. In spite of the increasing personal tax Washington was under as president, really something all presidents and all public figures face, Washington could have been president for the rest of his life if he wanted to. He was still that popular. But Washington decided enough was enough. That someone else deserved a turn. That the country just wasn't just about George Washington. He wasn't the only one who could lead the nation. So he trusted the vote. That the people would make the right decision. Now, some presidents would consider a third term, but political realities of their time periods made that completely impossible. Roosevelt was the one who was able to, because of his own popularity and the nature of the times, was able to win a third term. But years after he died, the 22nd Amendment was ratified, limiting presidents to only 2 terms. So after 1951, presidents could only serve 2 terms in office. But Washington had managed to do quite a bit. The first time an office or a government like this had been established on this scale, he'd organized a national government with considerable power and influence. He'd stabilized the northwestern frontier, most notably from the British, but as well as from the Native American tribes. The benefit of that can be greatly debated. But basically, outside of the tribes, Washington was able to gain control of his nation's own territory from nations that were much more powerful than the United States and really were not interested in the problems of the United States. 3 new states were added: Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. They covered territory from Great Britain and Spain. Secured the national government, national credit, that is, was able to get the government's bills paid and get the government working on a paying basis. But despite its successes, we were subject to more attacks as the partisan press emerged. He delivered his final address to the nation, was actually at a small dinner in Philadelphia, announced his intention to decline a third term. But the addresses were published in a newspaper in Philadelphia and then distributed around the country. Washington's farewell address was studied in schools for many years afterwards. School children for years often had to memorize portions of that speech. But in this address, he states his resolve to decline a third term. He called for the need for unity among the American people, to cry the spirit of sectionalism and partisanship. So that political parties and sectionalism, especially, would damage the nation. The people must come together for a larger purpose for the nation. In foreign relations, he called for the United States to treat all nations with good faith and justice, and to avoid permanent foreign alliances, pointing out that foreign needs were often contrary to national needs. This would be a promise that the United States kept until NATO was organized in 1949. When the French Revolution erupted in France, France went through many different governments. The priorities of the governments were shifting wildly. One decided the king was overthrown and beheaded. And at one point, France basically had declared itself to be a republic and declared war on every monarchy in Europe, and tried to get the United States to get into the war with them, basically fight every nation in Europe. Like I said, Washington barely managed to get the United States out of the Treaty of Alliance that basically the United States had sworn they would protect France as well as France protecting the United States. The United States couldn't afford a war in the 1790s. So Washington was able to craft a neutrality declaration, and since the United States had formed the alliance with a previous government, that is a government that no longer existed, the government of King Louis XVI, the French eventually agreed to drop the provisions of the Treaty of Alliance. So the permanent alliance of the United States was established with the French, and the American Revolution was dropped, and the next permanent alliance the United States would enter, minus temporary alliances in wartime, would be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization after World War II. But now, with Washington not running, you have an election. The first partisan election for president ever. The election of 1796. Now, at this point, it's a completely different type of election that you might see today, 2015, 2016. Except campaigns are run differently, candidates are chosen differently. There are no national nominating conventions. Primaries only began in the 20th century. Like I say, the ordinary rank and file party members would have much of a voice in the process, either through their local or state conventions or through caucuses, not even primary elections. Instead, what they had at this time was what they called the Congressional Caucus. Congressional Caucus. Through this system, the leaders of the parties in Congress would decide who the presidential nominee is going to be for their party. So no one at the state level, just at the federal, just simply members of Congress getting together deciding who their candidate would be. And once the candidates are chosen, the candidates are not going to go out and campaign. It's not going to be done. Because see, the thinking was, in those days, that in a republic it was considered unseemly for one man to be seeking that much power for himself. The thinking was, the man does not seek the office seeks the man. The office tries to find the best person for that job in the entire country. So candidates would not go out and speak on their own behalf, go to campaign appearances. You wouldn't see them in debates with other candidates. You'd see them going out shaking hands, kissing babies. You wouldn't see them on talk shows or anything. Of course, you're not going to see them in 1996, no TV yet. But you wouldn't see them going out in public glad-handing or making a fool out of themselves. They'd be sitting at home, letting their friends run the campaign for them. Now, two parties are the Federalists and the Republicans. But remember, the Republicans are the forerunners of the Democrats, have nothing to do with the modern-day Republican Party. Similarly, Federalists, just their own party. Modern-day Republicans have nothing to do with the Federalists. Now, for the Jeffersonian Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans, or just Republicans, the choice is obvious: Thomas Jefferson. From Virginia, author of the Declaration of Independence, former Secretary of State, former ambassador. It's an excellent reputation. Former governor, former member of the Continental Congress, so many other qualifications. His vice presidential running mate is Aaron Burr of New York. Now, for the Jeffersonian Republicans, hatred of Jay's Treaty helped them, but campaigning as French ambassador on their behalf really cost Jefferson. The French government was so radical at this point. There are a lot of disputes between the French government and the American government, particularly the French seizure of American ships trying to challenge the French blockade against Britain. particularly the Reign of Terror, in which this new Republican France had basically tried to round up and execute as many of their perceived enemies as possible, made the French seem radical and unreliable. And with Jefferson, the former ambassador to France, getting support from the current French ambassador to the United States, it didn't win him a lot of friends and supporters. On the Federalists, you see very deep divisions. Alexander Hamilton had been Washington's right-hand man and protege for years. It seemed the obvious choice, but he'd made too many enemies during the Washington administration, and scandals kind of surrounding him made the Federalist Party decide it probably wasn't the best idea. So instead, the Congressional Caucus chose Vice President John Adams. Adams of Massachusetts had a long, distinguished career. One of the co-authors of the Declaration of Independence, member of the Continental Congress, Vice President. Actually, stable, reliable, very intelligent, loyal, patriotic. Thomas Pinckney, fresh from a success of Pinckney's Treaty negotiation in Spain, was chosen as the vice presidential nominee for the Federalists. Pinckney being from South Carolina. So with both parties, you try to see appeals to both sections of the country. Jefferson from Virginia to the south, bounced out against Aaron Burr from New York to the north. Adams, Massachusetts to the north, bounced out against Thomas Pinckney, South Carolina to the south. The problem is, the divisions in the Federalist Party are deeper than what a lot of people realize. Hamilton hated Adams since the Revolution. Apparently during the war, Adams had tried to revoke Hamilton's father-in-law, man General Schuyler, from command of the Saratoga campaign. Hamilton saw Pinckney as more malleable and tried to get the electors in the South switch their votes to Pinckney instead of Adams. Basically trying to get Pinckney to become president instead of Adams. You have to remember this point. They have two ballots, each of the electors. They aren't designated for president or vice president. Basically, the person with the most number of electoral votes is elected president. So what ends up happening is South Carolina ends up dividing its votes between Pinckney and Jefferson. New England heard what was going on with Southern Federalists trying to drop Adams in favor of Pinckney, and they end up dropping Pinckney from their ballots altogether. So Pinckney was cut out of the presidency and the vice presidency. And John Adams ended up winning by only 3 votes over the new vice president, Thomas Jefferson. So Adams gets 71 electoral votes, Jefferson gets 68. But Pinckney gets 59 and Burr gets 30. Because Jefferson got the second most number of votes, he becomes vice president. Adams is president. See, in this way, this is actually the only time in history that you have president and vice president from separate parties. Adams the Federalist and Jefferson the Democratic Republican. Well, Adams' philosophy. Adams had a distinguished career as a lawyer in Massachusetts as a leader of the American Revolution, but something of a martyr. He didn't share Jefferson's absolute faith in the people, nor did he share Hamilton's wish for what Adams called an aristocracy of paper wealth. Adams liked titles, always felt unappreciated. He was a calm, deliberate man. He had a penchant for interchanging the word monarchical with executive, which means the same thing, but led upon as a charge as Federalists wanted a monarchy. The Adams cabinet basically it's Washington holdovers from late in the Washington administration. Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State in 1793. Hamilton resigned as Secretary of Treasury in 1795. So, who had been in the Washington administration stayed over the Adams administration. Adams felt like they're good enough for the old man, they're good enough for him. So at state, you've got Timothy Pickering. Treasury, you have Oliver Wolcott. And Secretary of War, Joseph Henry. And another veteran of the American Revolution. What we see at the beginning of the Adams administration in 1797 is something of a Cold War sort of France. It can be called the quasi-war. Where France and Britain are at war with each other again, basically over the French Revolution. The British have a naval blockade against France and French ports, again, trying to keep anybody from trading with France, basically trying to starve them into submission. And France is doing the same thing as British ports, basically trying to keep anybody from trading with Britain. The problem is, though, you've got countries like the United States that are neutral in this, just trying to mind their own business. They're trying to trade with both sides. Yes, it's trying to trade with Britain and France. But they have these naval blockades up that are preventing them from trading, and both the British and the French are seizing American ships in the high seas for trying to run these blockades. So at this point, the French are raiding American ships in the high seas involved with trade with Britain. Now, the Americans kind of expected this kind of thing from Britain, but a one-time ally like France doing it really soured the American public's opinion in France. Now, because the U.S. had been negotiating with Britain and Spain, the relations were improving somewhat. They gotten some ground through Pinckney's Treaty and Jay's Treaty. That at least France and at least Spain and Britain were willing to talk to the United States. Well, Washington had replaced an irrepressibly pro-French ambassador, James Monroe, who had been a protege of Jefferson and Madison. James Monroe would be the 5th president of the United States. With a less pro-French ambassador, Charles Cosworth Pinckney, who was Thomas Pinckney's brother. Diplomacy ran in the family. But the French refused to accept Charles Cosworth Pinckney because they liked Monroe so much. But by 1797, as a quasi-war, 300 American ships had been seized on the high seas. Just merchant ships, but 300 American ships had been seized. Relationships have carried to the point that France and the United States have broken off diplomatic relations with one another. So to try to smooth things over, Adams sends a delegation to France, going to be known as the XYZ affair. So the 3 delegates sent over are Charles Cosworth Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry. Elbridge Gerry had actually been a member of the Constitutional Convention, or a prominent politician in Massachusetts. Well, the delegation sent to France to try to smooth relations in October 1797. There was a faction pushing for a war with France called the High Federalists, but Adams wanted peace. What ends up happening, though, is a total diplomatic disaster. The delegation is left waiting at the French Foreign Ministry for weeks. Basically, they come in, speak to the French Foreign Minister, a man named Talleyrand. They say, Monsieur Talleyrand, they cannot be disturbed right now. Please have a seat. We'll get to you as soon as we can. So it'd be like this day after day. They'd sit there all day waiting for someone to come talk to them. They're left here for weeks trying to speak to someone in the Foreign Ministry. Well, finally, 3 French bureaucrats, agents of Talleyrand, and referred to as X, Y, and Z in the Adams scathing report to Congress on what happens. Well, X, Y, and Z sit and tell our boys that the French government will not begin negotiations unless the U.S. made a $12 million loan to France and gave $250,000 to the 5 directors then running the French government. Basically, they had a plural executive. $250,000, $50,000 each, plus $12 million loan to France. Basically, France wants a bribe just to even open negotiations. Now, such bribes are common practice among European diplomats at the time, but the United States is a new country and they're not going to play this game. Pinckney, enraged, stands up and says, "No, not a sixpence," and the 3 storm out and return to the United States. Well, the affair created a stir in the United States, and Pinckney's reply translated a stirring slogan at a banquet in the United States, toasting and honoring the diplomats. Famous toast, "Millions for defense, but not a penny for tribute." Federalists and even Republicans began calling for war at this point. So Adams began strengthening the American military. At this point, there's no Navy, very few troops still. There are 3 ships begun in the Washington administration, a lot to be completed, continue to be completed by the end of 1797. The Constitution, the United States, and the Constellation. In fact, the Constitution is still at port and still officially on the register for the U.S. Navy. It's basically kind of more of a ceremonial ship. The U.S. keeps it to kind of honor the early days of the Navy. It's still maintained, an old wooden sail ship. It's built in 1797. More ships were built. By the end of 1798, there are 20 ships in the U.S. Navy. By the end of 1799, 33. 1797, you got 3. 1798, you've got 20. 1799, you've got 33. By the end of 1798, the quasi-war exploded more violently with an undeclared naval war basically in effect after the French captured an American schooner in the West Indies. The 2 were actually firing on each other every so often. 1798, the new army of 10,000 organized for 3-year enlistments. Washington's called in by Adams out of retirement to be commander-in-chief. Washington did do so. No problem. Not even asking to be paid for this, because his country needs him. He's going to step up to the plate and do it. But Washington's old, his health is failing. Actually, he's 66 years old at this point. That may not mean as much in the 21st century, but that's pretty old in the 18th century. Gave his condition that Hamilton be his second command. He'd always trusted Hamilton, always been a good, effective officer. Feels Hamilton be up to assisting with the effort. Well, Adams doesn't like Hamilton, but knows Hamilton doesn't like him, but he can't say no to the old man, so Adams appoints Hamilton as second command. So Hamilton gets his field command. He dreamed of attacking Louisiana and Florida to keep it out of French hands, and even taking this new army and invading South America to seize the territory for the United States. It wasn't to be. By 1799, the threat of land war with France had subsided. Talleyrand in France in 1798 realizes how bad the situation was getting to the United States and began offering peace overtures by the latter part of 1798. Adams seized on this peace overture. It came to new negotiation and understanding with France. Now, Hamilton and his faction, the Hamiltonians, the High Federalists, they wanted war badly with France, but Adams wanted peace. But the best interest of the nation was peace with France and all the nations of the world. Adams had sent peace envoys to Paris to discuss terms with the French. By this time they get there, it's November 1799. Napoleon is now in charge. He has agreed to give up claims and losses from France seizing American ships. The alliance of 1778 was formally struck down. New trade terms were established and the quasi-war ended. So, peace between France and the United States. But in the meantime, though, the Jeffersonians were expecting the quasi-war and the rhetoric of a potential war against France was an excuse to try to gather public support for the Federalists and put down any kind of domestic opposition, particularly try to destroy the Jeffersonian Party. Their fears were confirmed in 1798 with the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts. There's a series of 4 acts passed through by the Federalist-led Congress and signed into law by Federalist President John Adams. Essentially, these are acts dealing with naturalization and criticism of the government. Now, see, by this point, you have a lot of French and Irish immigrants coming to the United States. And immigrants were identifying very strong with the Jeffersonian Republican Party. In fact, even today, immigrants tend to vote for Democrats. But the French and Irish especially were being targeted because fearing they support the same arguments against immigration see today. The French coming to the United States, fearing that they're going to come and try to start a revolution here in this country. Same fears about the Irish. The Irish are very poor, and they had a deep hatred of England. Fear that the Irish are going to come and try to overwhelm the United States with their Roman Catholic heritage and also try to stir up revolution against Britain. See, the Federalists are fairly pro-British at this point. The Jeffersonians see it as the pro-French party. And between these two, the relatively pro-English Federalists and relatively pro-French Jeffersonians, it seemed logical that the French and the Irish would tend towards the Jeffersonian party. In fact, they were. But the Federalists are fairly aristocratic, kind of elitist. When these immigrants are coming in, they are working poor. They don't have a lot of money to their names, and so they really don't identify with this aristocratic party designed to mostly support the aristocrats. There's no benefit for them. So, the French and the Irish coming in, they were increasingly Jeffersonian. The Federalists feared they're bent on revolution and do whatever they can to try to stop them, particularly trying to blunt their political power. So, the first of the Alien and Sedition Acts was the Naturalization Act. Residency requirements for citizenship were increased from 5 years up to 14 years. There'd be pushes to push it even higher in later years. But basically that was it with citizenship in those days. You didn't need naturalization tests, or immigration attorneys, or anything else, green cards or anything, to become a citizen. Basically, you just had to prove you're here for a certain set number of time. In this case, 14 years. But when Jefferson comes into office a few years later, this is going to be repealed, and one's going to go back to like 5 years or even 3 years after that. Second, the Alien Act. Under this act, the president could expel any dangerous alien, that is, not little green man alien, but basically any outsider, any foreigner. Basically, any foreigner who's in the United States, the president can decide is dangerous, basically kick out of the country. Goes even further with the Alien Enemy Act. Basically, the alien enemy in this case, basically meaning a person, a foreigner from a country the United States was at war with. Essentially, the president could round up and arrest anybody who happened to be from that country at will, just because they were from that country. See similar things happening in the United States during World War II, the roundup detention of the Japanese. Basically, American citizens of Japanese birth, either born in Japan or even those actually born in the United States, being arrested and sent to camps all over the United States just because their ancestors were Japanese. No other reason, no proof they'd actually done anything or wanted to do anything in the United States. But doing that is here, the Alien Enemy Act. In fact, 2 of those internment camps in World War II were set up here in Arkansas. We'll talk about that more when we get to World War II. The Alien Enemy Act. Portions of this is early 1798. Basically, the president of the act wouldn't even need a trial. Just basically would arrest them and throw them in jail, throw away the key for the rest of the war. Now, after Adams left office, this act was repealed. But like I said, would be brought back, at least in some element, during World War II. So the Naturalization Act is going to be repealed. The 4th one, which will also end up being repealed, is the Sedition Act. That was controversial at all. Basically, it made it a crime to interfere with federal officials and also to incite insurrection or riot. Also made it illegal to publish, write, or say anything false, scandalous, or malicious against the government or an official. Let's go over here. Illegal to interfere with federal officials. Or to incite an insurrection or riot. Also making it illegal to write, publish, or say anything worth with law, false, scandalous, or malicious. Against the government or an official. Illegal to write, publish, or say anything false, scandalous, or malicious against the government or an official. Basically, you can say something true against them that's scandalous or malicious. Because I did say false, scandalous, and malicious, or they can say something critical against a government official, even if it's true. It's a clear violation of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. Basically, the Federalist Party just made it a crime to criticize the Federalist Party. Since they're in charge of Congress and the presidency, they control the federal government. They said, you can't criticize us. As a result, there are 15 indictments under the Act, 10 convictions, all Jeffersonian Republicans, all outspoken Jeffersonian Republicans. Included Benjamin Bach, who was the grandson of Benjamin Franklin, arrested and sentenced under this act. A sitting congressman is arrested for criticizing President Adams. That is a U.S. Representative Matthew Lyon of Vermont. Lyon was sentenced to 4 months in jail and fined $1,000 for condemning what he called Adams's continued grasp for power and his unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. And while he was in jail, Lyon continued to send out material condemning Adams and the Federalists. The people of Vermont re-elected him while he was still in jail. Actually, he'd served a couple more terms in Congress, but he ended up moving across the country, eventually spending his last years in Arkansas. He ran for territorial delegate, tried to return to Congress late in his life, but basically spent a lot of his time working for the federal government, negotiating with the remaining tribes living in Arkansas before Arkansas became a state. But he had a sitting congressman arrested. Well, Jefferson and Madison decried the Alien Sedition Acts, got the Kentucky and Virginia legislatures to send out resolutions condemning the Alien Sedition Acts. Went so far as in suggesting that states had the right to nullify or ignore unconstitutional acts, which would cause some problems later on, but these powers of the federal government, the federal courts, are still undefined as yet. One thing Jefferson and Madison did know was this is a clear violation of the Constitution. Federalists made it even worse. Remember all those boats they're building, that army they're building. That's going to be expensive. It costs a lot of money. They need to raise taxes to pay for that. So in 1798, the Federalists imposed direct taxes on slaves, houses, and land that proved to be very unpopular, costing them even more deeply. So they'll be moving into the 1800 election very, very popular. On December 1799, George Washington had quietly at his home in Mount Vernon of pneumonia. Gone out riding one cold rainy day, caught a bad cold, turned into pneumonia, and they didn't have much treatment for it, and he died. Washington's death was the end of an era. He requested that they wait a few days to make sure he was dead, so he had him laying in state in the front room, which is not unusual for a lot of homes in that time period. Washington was actually terrified of being buried alive. Interestingly enough, in some cultures, in some parts of the world, it's just the opposite. They so feared not being buried at all that they would rather be buried alive. Washington freed his slaves on his death, the only founding father to do so. It's more nationally. Washington, a great figure, considered the father of the country, had now passed, and his story grew into legend in the years afterward. But now we're going into 1800. Washington's not here. And the Federalists are very, very popular. Now, because Adams had decided for peace with France in 1798-99, probably cost him the election. If he had gone to war, he could have united the party, the country behind him, decided the safety and well-being of the American people were more important than his own political considerations. People should not be dying just so he can win re-election. But the nation's interest had to be tied to peace. Well, the Jeffersonians go with their ticket for 1796. Thomas Jefferson, now vice president. And Aaron Burr. The Federalists go with John Adams again. This time, instead of Thomas Pinckney from the Pinckney's Treaty, they're going with Charles Cotesworth here at the XYZ affair. So the Pinckneys were in demand in those days, but for the Federalists, not enough. Well, Hamilton still hated Adams. He issued a pamphlet questioning Adams' fitness to be president, but it was intended only for Federalist leaders. But you know how things go. You say something nasty about somebody, write it down, it's going to get around. And it got into the hands of people that Hamilton at least wanted to be in, which was hands of the Jeffersonian Republicans. The Republicans got a hold of it, distributed it throughout the country, basically Hamilton denouncing Adams' fitness to be president. Well, this is a very vicious election, even by modern standards. Jefferson is attacked as a French radical, what they call a Jacobin, and an atheist. Jefferson didn't respond to the attacks. He simply directed the campaign from his home in Virginia, Monticello, by mail. Friends called him the farmer's friend, the champion of liberty and frugal government. The Federalists did very badly in the election, but Adams fared slightly better, edging up. See here on the map on page 229, the Federalists edged basically doing better in the West, and Adams getting most of the support in New England and the eastern portions of the country. Delaware, New Jersey, splitting Pennsylvania and North Carolina with the Jeffersonians. But Jeffersonians come out on top, 73 electoral votes to 65 for Adams and Pinckney. Remember, 2 ballots. So the election goes to the Jeffersonians. Adams quietly retires and goes home. Adams is actually the first president to live and become the White House. Living the last few months of his presidency in the executive mansion in Washington, D.C., before turning it over to Jefferson. Washington never lived in it. But there is a problem, though. Jefferson and Burr both got 73 votes. Remember, the Constitution said at this point, electors got 2 ballots, presumably one for president, one for vice president, but there's nothing specifically saying president or vice president on these ballots. So Jefferson and Burr basically tied the election, which would create a whole other series of problems. Now, you would think in this kind of case that Aaron Burr, having been chosen as vice president, would simply stand aside and say, no, I'm vice president. I was chosen as vice president. Our leader is Thomas Jefferson, so I'm going to hand the office over to him. That's not Aaron Burr. See, look up scoundrel in the dictionary. There's a picture of Aaron Burr next to it. Burr decided to go for the whole thing with the backing of Alexander Hamilton. So it has to go. So in the Constitution, the election has to be decided in the House of Representatives, in Congress. And in this arrangement, the members of Congress vote by state. Each state gets 1 vote. So here's what happens. It's deadlocked every time. They vote once, tie, no winner. They vote a second time, tie between Jefferson and Burr. Hamilton, the Federalists are pushing for Burr. Jefferson is pushing for Jefferson's also pushing for his own candidacy by mail quietly. Remember, office seeks command. But his allies, the Jeffersonians, are pushing heavily for his election in Congress. So they're going through it over and over again. 35 times they still come out with winner between Jefferson and Burr. Finally, the 36th round of voting. It's coming down to the one lone congressman from Delaware, a Federalist. Well, he's scribbling out, going between Burr and Jefferson, can't figure out which. And Jeffersonians have made promises this isn't going to mean a wholesale removal of Federalists from office just because they're Federalists. So, frustrated, this congressman writes down Jefferson. Now, on the 36th ballot, Jefferson is elected president, but Burr is vice president. Jefferson was not happy with Burr because of this. And in 1804, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution will be ratified, clearing this up, giving us the modern electoral college. Basically, the modern electoral college system with distinct ballots for president and vice president. If you're not eligible for president, if you're not eligible for president, you can't be vice president. And also change how tie votes be decided in the House. Candidate must receive a majority of votes in the electoral college. In a dispute going to go to Congress, basically a tie vote, or candidate receives less than a majority of the votes. House would vote by states for president. Senate would vote for vice president. So Jefferson will be inaugurated on March 4th, 1801. Now, in those days, presidents were inaugurated in March, not in January like they are now. That changed to come on to the 1930s. But in the meantime, Federalists have been pushed out of the presidency and Congress, but they still have some time left in office. They can still push through legislation. Remember, the end of 1800, not until March of 1801, that the Jeffersonians come into power. So, Judiciary Act of 1801. Basically, 2 out of 3 branches lost to the Federalists. They decided to pack the judiciary, the one remaining branch, with as many Federalists as they possibly can. Try to hold that branch of government. This is what came to be known as the thing as midnight judges. Appointments being signed by President Adams up to midnight on the night before he leaves office. Judiciary Act 1801 created 16 district courts, circuit courts as judges for each, including numbers of clerks, U.S. Marshals, attorneys, all be appointed by Adams, all would be Federalists. And for the District of Columbia, 42 justices of the peace. Now in Arkansas, justice of the peace, basically that's a member of the quorum court, basically the county level legislature, the county level council. They don't really have any kind of judicial powers. But in other states, like Texas and so forth, a justice of the peace is a small claims court judge. But you've got a city that's not even barely 5,000 people, and they have 42 justices of the peace. A lot of these Federalist appointments will be later rescinded, but the number of people on the Supreme Court expanded from 6 up to 11. And John Marshall, a diehard Federalist, is appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a position he'll hold for 34 years. So this is what's waiting for Jefferson when he comes into the White House, March 4th, 1801. The whole exercise is called the Revolution of 1800. Kind of dramatic title, but this wasn't really a revolution. What really happens here in 1800 with this election is this is the first time ever that one party transfers power to another. Never been done before in the United States, although it happens all the time now. A lot of people fearing what would happen, because in some countries, transfer of power from one party to another sometimes means violence, riots, civil war, attempted coup to try to keep it from happening. What ends up happening is, in the United States, when the Federalists hand over power to the Jeffersonians, nothing. The day is peaceful, calm. Established an important precedent in American politics that may not agree with people, but you always have the vote. There's always the next election. If you lose this one, you've always got it next time. So the Revolution of 1800, one party, transfer of power to another, peace rules the land. The Jefferson administration begins with many new challenges facing the nation.